Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to Ask Zajef Hu Tao Edition! Woo! Let's just get right into it. And as usual, say thank you to Shuffle for compiling the questions for us. First things first, what's her overall place in the meta, pull value, and how much has changed with her since Dendra's release, if at all? She both got some pretty massive positive changes and negative changes from the release of Dendro. If you look at positive changes, you have a few buffs, not just from Dendro directly, right? Just look from like around that time, right? Yelan got released one patch before Dendro. Hydro Resonance got reworked in 3.0 with the release of Dendro. A lot of the units that work well with Hu Tao became a little bit in lesser demand in other teams due to the emergence of a bunch of new different teams that didn't rely on those units. But also, right, on the flip side of this, we have gotten Dendro teams that fulfill the same kind of niche that Hu Tao used to be arguably the best at. What Hu Tao is very good at is single target damage. Now, when it comes to single target damage, before the release of Dendro, she was arguably the best single target focused carry. There were some other honorable mentions that could outperform her in specific situations. Obviously, not every enemy behaves the same way. Some enemies, specifically the perpetual mechanical array, you guys want to see something fun? Finally! On our last charge attack, we finally got one charge attack to hit him. Some enemies have weird hitboxes, specifically the PMA. That's like the biggest offender of it. Like, your charge attacks will not hit him. So obviously in situations like that, please just let me play something else, right? But that's far from always being the case. And she was still like very, very strong when it came to single target stuff. Now, Dendro gave us Hyperbloom, which is a reaction that is insane in single target and still pretty good in AoE, but like specifically in single target. And when it comes to the kind of ceilings that you can expect out of a free-to-play Hu Tao, where you're not like going out of your way to save up your primo gems to go for her C1, to go for her weapon, to go for elegy on your supports, to go for all of those things that can make her stronger, but that require a lot of primo gems, right? Her ceiling can kind of be rivaled by the kind of ceilings that you can find in Hyperbloom teams. That's not to say Hu Tao teams are not good. If you have like actually insane artifacts, if you have one of the things that can make her better, like you have her C1, like but only her C1, or you have Homa and only Homa, like those are the things that can skew results in her favor, and she definitely can't be better than the Hyperbloom teams. But what I found is she's also kind of just a headache compared to the Hyperbloom teams. Hyperbloom teams are just so incredibly brain dead to play that even in the situations where Hu Tao, when played perfectly, performs better, when you do all of your cancels right, I'd still rather play Hyperbloom. So personally, right, on my account with what I do, unless it's just because I feel like playing Hu Tao or because my chat asks me to play Hu Tao or show something with Hu Tao, I don't really play her anymore. I got Hu Tao on, I think, her first rerun. And the reason I got her is because I am of the opinion that Xiangling is very good, and I wanted to get a triple crown Hu Tao and learn her cancels perfectly, so that when I say that Xiangling is better than Hu Tao, I could be taken, or I could not be dismissed as, no, you just haven't played her. So I have a triple crown Hu Tao with some pretty solid stats. Now, I'm not on 4-piece Crimson or 4-piece Shimenawas, I'm on a 2-piece 2-piece, but it is actually better than my 4-piece sets because the artifacts quality are just very, very good. The reason for that is because I wanted to shit on her, basically. I am a very dedicated hater. That being said, though, the reason I did that specifically with Hu Tao is not because I think she's bad. It's far from that. I think she's a very good unit. The reason I did that is because I had some, and still have, some reservations, you know, when people said that, like, wow, Hu Tao's broken, you should pull for her. And that mainly comes from the fact that on a lot of different accounts, if you are going to be pulling for Hu Tao, unless you have a bunch of other Hydro units, that likely means that you're gonna have to bench your Xiangling. And the upgrade that you get in single target, I would argue, is not even worth the downgrade that you get in AoE, even without considering the fact that you have to spend primos for it. And so, I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to pull value, but the main reason why I was, and to some extent still am, a bit more negative when I present my thoughts on a unit like Hu Tao is because while she is very good, I feel like her pull value is very much overstated by a lot of people, and I don't want people to be pulled into that to see their favorite content creator using a Hu Tao and like being like, wow, this is broken, and then pull for her and then just be disappointed with her performance. That being said though, I do want to make it very clear, Hu Tao is a good unit, and she is one of those units that gets better when you start being an account where you want to do vertical investment, where instead of using your primos to pull a bunch of different teams that you want to swap between, you use your primos to go for the 5-star weapon and a few constellations and maybe some constellations on their supports or 5-star weapons on the supports, right? So the unit that scales pretty well with that. But to come back to like her overall place on the meta, I'd say Hu Tao used to be basically the best choice for that, like vertical investment for bosses and single target stuff. Now you have a lot more options, which means that while she is still very good for that, I think there's a bit less of an incentive to pull for her. What's her pull value? Well, it ties back into this a little bit with her being a very good unit, but she's basically tied to Xiao. Like, you can play her without Xiao. You can play her in just like weird overload bullshit. You can play her in Mono Pyro, but generally people tend to play her with Xiao, and for good reason, right? Like, Xiao works very, very, very well with her. That can make it so that you have a lot less flexibility for your second team, because Xiao is just a unit that's in such high demand in so many different teams that specifically wishing for a carry unit that needs Xiao, needs in quotes, like it's not necessarily needs, but heavily wants Xiao, gives you a little bit less flexibility for your other team, and can be harder to justify depending on what you already have on your account, because it means you can't use Xiao on the other side, which is something that can have an impact on her pull value. But again, right, that's the kind of thing that it really depends on what else you have on your account. Do you have a team that functions very well without needing Hydro, and so you don't need Xiao on your other side, and so that's not a downside for your account? In that case, you can disregard what I just said, right? Like, it won't matter for you. Do you have, I don't know, like maybe you're on your other side, you're doing Sailing Vape, but you have Child. Oh, well, you don't really need to use Xiao on that side then. So he's free. Like, this specific part of her pull value is very account dependent. All in all, I'd say that she's somewhat average in terms of pull value, where she can be a very strong single target carry, but she's far from being the only option that you would want to go for. Yeah, she's basically just a unit that, like, you're not going to regret skipping her, but if you wish for her and, like, in a situation where you can actually use her without nerfing the fuck out of your other team, you're probably not going to regret having gone for her either. Unless one of the other factors come into play. What I mean by other factors is basically the like difficulty to play and dying of dies. Depending on what units you have, it's possible that your best Hu Tao team can't really slot in a shielder. If you don't have Zhongli, if you don't have C4 Yanfei, your Toma C0, it's like, ugh. It can be very hard to like justify slotting in a shielder in her team. And when that's the case, it can actually happen that you just die a lot. Because at the end of the day, Hu Tao has a high HP value, right? But you have to keep in mind, right? She wants to be under 50% HP. She does more damage with her burst when she's under 50% HP. She does more damage in general when she's under 50% HP. Which means that the actual HP value that you want to be at is not 31k, it's 15k, 15.5. You look at basically any other on-fielder, I mean, even Nahida has more. She has a bit more defense, so that's a little bit more like effective HP, but another thing to keep in mind is you're not going to be exactly at that, right? On other characters, you can afford to just use a healer on your team and always stay max health, and when you take damage, it puts you back to max health. With Hu Tao, if you use a healer, it's going to heal you above 50%, so you kind of don't really want that. So very often, people are going to run her without a healer. Now, if you don't have a healer, you're not always going to be at exactly 15k. Most of the time, you're going to hover closer to between 7 and 12. Now, with the damage reduction that Xiao provides, which is one of the many reasons why Xiao works so well with Yelan. But with the damage reduction that Xiao provides, right, this 29% plus 20% of his hydro damage, so around 40%, right? That's still like enough HP to not like be completely just like panicking all the time, but it definitely can be low enough HP for people who aren't used to doing their cancels without needing to dash, or just like the enemy's attack patterns. It can be something that can make it harder not to die. Another thing is a lot of people recommend Shimenawas on Hu Tao, and I mean, we'll talk about the artifact sets later on, but if you do go for Shimenawas, that makes it even easier to die accidentally, because you can't use your burst at the beginning of your E removes a lot of HP for you, so if you get hit, like if you're on half HP, you use your E and you get hit at the same time, because your E has like an animation time that's not too long, but that's not really cancelable, then you're probably gonna be at like 2000 HP, and then like that's one attack from death. So if you can't use your burst to heal up, or for the iframes, that can be pretty difficult. And that goes into some of the reasons why generally I don't like recommending Shimenawa's over Crimson Witch. But the point basically just being, compared to a lot of other carries, because she really wants to be under 50% HP, you're still generally less tanky than other carries. You're less vulnerable when it comes to getting interrupted, because her E offers a little bit of resistance to interruption, and Xingqiu's burst and E also does that, and those two together makes you almost immune to interruption, which means that you don't need more resistance to interruption, but also because you don't really want to use healers, because healing yourself above that 50% HP threshold is a pretty substantial loss in damage, then the kind of options that you have for survivability are limited. And again, right, that's not something that makes her unplayable, and far from it, but it is something that's worth noting because some people struggle more with dodging the enemy's attacks. And so if that's the case for you, then that might be a con in your pros and cons list of things that, like, do I or do I not go for Hu Tao, right? The other thing was like the mechanical, like potential mechanical difficulty. Hu Tao can get a pretty substantial amount more damage out of learning how to do attack cancels, which are basically just her charge attack has a long end lag, which means that as soon as like your charge attack comes into contact with an enemy, and sometimes like even like before it, the damage goes through. But your charge attack animation is pretty long. So one thing that you can do is jump out of it or dash out of it. Now dashing means that you're spending a lot of stamina because charge attack is stamina and dashing is stamina. So dashing is generally something that's very hard to do without her Constellation 1. That makes charge attacks not cost stamina. But jump cancels are a thing that's actually pretty important on Hu Tao. However, jump cancels are somewhat overstated in both how difficult they are to do and how important they are. While jump cancels are a thing that you should learn if you're gonna play Hu Tao, it's literally just jumping before your charge attack is done. Like it's hold button, press spacebar. Hold button, press spacebar. It's not difficult. Getting the perfect timing can be difficult. And if you get like a pretty bad timing on it, jump cancels are often actually a DPS loss. If you jump too early, you just don't get the charge attack. However, there are actually a lot of enemies against which jump cancels aren't really necessary. You look at bosses, for example, and a lot of bosses, like you're fine without really doing any cancels. The gain that you get from cancels is actually somewhat, like it's there and it's nice, but if you don't do any cancels, like Hu Tao's still pretty good. The main moment when cancels are very good and very useful is when it's enemies that you can go through, right? Hu Tao's charge attack, right? It is kind of like a dash, and it can go through enemies. Some enemies, like there are enemies that like you just can't go through. Like you look at a lot of the bosses, right? The Primo Visha, their hitbox is too big, so it doesn't let you go through them. But if you can go through them, it's very possible that you go too far from them, and then that you're auto-targeting, instead of targeting the enemy that you just dashed through, is going to target the enemy that's right here instead, and you're just going to get yourself way further from the enemy you actually want to hit. So the main reason why jump cancels can be very important to learn, even if like you aren't trying to min-max your damage perfectly, is just to make sure that you keep attacking the same enemy. Because even if you lose one or even two charge attacks, it's better than getting one charge attack on the right enemy and then attacking the sits and flies for the whole rest of the chamber, you know? But yeah, that's the main reason why cancels are important. Finally, how much has changed with her since Dendro's release, if at all? Honestly, not much. Dendro teams do not like Hu Tao, and Hu Tao does not like Dendro teams. You can technically play her in some like Burgeon stuff, but because Burgeon deals self-damage, because Burgeon's self-damage is not reduced by Xingqiu's damage reduction, and because it's very hard to justify running healers on your Hu Tao team, then Burgeon Hu Tao is not something I would recommend. If you have C1, you can kind of like dodge your own Burgeon damage. It's not something I'd recommend. Who between Alhaitham, Xiao, and Hu Tao would I say is the better carry to go for this patch? Yelan. No, but I don't think Xiao would ever be my answer. So it's either Alhaitham or Hu Tao, really depending on what units you have, like what teams you're already using, and how Hu Tao or Alhaitham would change like what you're doing. Like it's hard to answer in a vacuum. Assuming a player is proficient at executing Hu Tao's charge attacks, how much investment would it take for Hu Tao to out DPS Nahida Hyperbloom? It depends. So the short answer is when you can one rotate with Hu Tao, you out DPS Nahida Hyperbloom. Here's the thing about Hu Tao, okay? You do your setup, right? And during your setup, you don't do much damage. After that, you swap to Hu Tao, you use your E, and you have a lot of DPS. And then after that, you have some downtime, and then you do your setup again. If I open Paint, if you have DPS over time, it's gonna be like, ooh, 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 ooh. Very cool. This is when your Hu Tao E is active, right? And this is when it's not. With Nahida Hyperbloom, you start out by doing your setups, right? And again, right, during your setup, you don't have much damage, and then your reactions start happening, and it goes like here. But the thing is, during your second setups, your Nahida E is still out, your Raiden E is still out, your Xingqiu's burst is still active, and your Yilan burst is still active. So as long as you keep weaving in normal attacks during your second setups, instead of it going down all the way here, it goes down like here. And so, the longer your fight goes, the higher your average DPS, because it makes it so that the part of your DPS that's like really low at the very, very beginning of the chamber is a less significant portion of your total time. Which means that if you are very, very high investment, your average DPS is going to be lower because a larger portion of your time is spent at relatively low DPS. What that means is that if you reach the kind of investment where like Hu Tao can kill the enemies in one rotation, then you don't have any of this downtime, and you can artificially inflate your DPS. So all in all, basically because Hu Tao's damage in her team is somewhat front-loaded, whereas Hyperbloom is more sustained, then it means that when you start reaching the kind of investments where one window of front-loaded DPS is enough to kill the enemies, then Hu Tao becomes better. There can also be situations where, for example, you're against you're against an enemy that has some periods where it's invulnerable. You look at Magukenki, you look at PMA, right? And depending on where exactly in your rotation those invulnerability periods happen, that can either be an advantage for the front-loaded or an obstacle for the front-loaded. There's no real, like, actual point where Hu Tao outscales Nahida. It's always gonna depend on how much HP the enemies you're fighting have versus your DPS, and the kind of, like, attack patterns that they have, whether they have invulnerability windows, whether they go in the air, they go underground, right? There's too many factors to give one point where one outscales the other. Despite her single target inclination, when forced into moderate AoE scenarios, say an Abyss rotation that has a chamber with 2 or 3 enemies between 2 chambers with a boss, so like this Abyss, how well does she fare against it compared to other single target carries? Hu Tao is mainly single target, but she's not true single target in the same way that like Yoimiya is, for example, right? You can still hit multiple enemies, and this is where like jump cancels and dash cancels can come into play even more, because if you manage to line yourself up for your charge attack to pass through multiple enemies, that increases your ability to deal with AoE by a significant amount. However, when you start getting into like real AoE scenarios where it's not just like in this Abyss, right? Here we have a few somewhat squishy things followed by a single target, a little bit tankier thing. But realistically, this is the easy half, and the second half is the one that's supposed to give you a challenge. If you play Hu Tao against this chamber, you are not gonna have fun. So it really depends on like how many enemies there are and the kind of attack patterns that they have, whether they group themselves or ungroup themselves naturally. Her AoE can be good, like decent, and it's definitely behaves a lot differently from a unit that's like truly single target. But I definitely wouldn't call it good. You can make her work in some AoE situation. You can make her good in some AoE situation, but I'd say that her AoE is pretty meh. Let's show how you can like kinda deal with some AoE stuff. Right, so you can see, right, these enemies are like pretty well lined up, which means that if I do a charge attack and I don't cancel it, I can kind of go through all of them. But yeah, right? So like if you can manage to group them up like very close together like that, you won't struggle too much in AoE. It really depends on the type of enemies you're facing and how well they group themselves up, how well you can group them up, whether they get knocked around when you use your charge attack, right? You look at Duo Bishops, for example, it can be very, very difficult because they're just gonna fly around everywhere. Talent priority overview, which challenge should be leveled first and how often does she want to use her burst? Okay, which challenge should be leveled first? There is no question about it, it's her normal attack. Leveling her normal attack gives her more damage than leveling her E. Like her E does give her some attack, but it doesn't give you as much damage as leveling your normal attack. Generally, E and burst then have a similar priority, but the thing about Hu Tao is, depending on your level of investment, sometimes you'll just get to the point where one burst is enough to one-shot the enemies, if you're a whale, for example, and then at that point, like, who needs normal attacks? You can fucking leave them level 1, why not? And then you want your E and your burst level 10. As a general rule, when it comes to like DPS, normal attack is highest, and then E and burst are like somewhat close, with E I think being a little bit higher, but I'm not sure. You can probably check the KQM Hu Tao guide. Normal attack, skill, burst, yeah. How often does she want to use her burst? It kind of depends. Her burst's animation time is like about as long as like 1.5 charge attacks or something. If you're using your burst instead of charge attacking, you're not actually gaining that much damage in single target. Although obviously you're hitting an AoE, so if you're hitting all the enemies, then that can be pretty significant gain of damage in AoE. But in single target specifically, you don't really want to use your burst like while your E is active. The thing is, the way that her E works is your E lasts 9 seconds, but it's not actually 9 seconds. It's a bit more than 9 seconds with hit lag. But then on top of that, while you're in the middle of an animation, your E stays active, right? Which means that if you're in the middle of a charge attack when your E duration expires, even if the duration has expired, the buff will still be there. And if you use burst before that animation is over without dashing out of it, you'll get your burst with the E still active, even if the duration has expired. Which means that in a situation like that, you're not losing uptime to use your burst, you're just gaining the burst on top of everything. When you use your burst there, it's a massive gain in damage, and you want to use it whenever you can. Thing is, if you end up using Shimenawas, using your burst at the end of your rotation like that can be risky in some teams, because you could potentially end up not having 15 energy by the time you want to use your E on your next rotation, in which case you don't activate the Shimenawa's effect, and you don't have a 4-piece set bonus. Her burst is also a pretty good defensive utility option. Having it available means that you're not in any real danger because you can always just burst and both have iframes and heal. But yeah, generally, I'd say that I end up using her burst every other rotation. I very rarely play Shimenawas because I don't have a good Shimenawas on my account. But when I play on other accounts and I play with Shimenawas, I kind of don't have my burst when I want to use it. So I generally often end up using it every like 3 or every 4 rotations, and I want to die when I want to use it and I don't have it, which is part of why I don't like Shimenawas too much. But I mean, we're almost at artifacts that overview, so we'll talk about that more. But yeah, basically her burst is good, but unless you're in AoE situations where it's going to be difficult for you to charge attack through a lot of enemies, it's not something that you want to use while your E is active, generally. I'm gonna try to show it properly. It's gonna be pretty difficult because I'm not that great at the cancels. Generally, if you do good cancels, you can do 8 and 2 Cs. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then my next attack is physical, right? So that's about as long, how long it lasts. Six, 7, 8, and I can use my burst, and it does still have, like, that was 40k damage. If I use my burst with my E active here, right, 32k damage. I was lower, I guess. Oh yeah, D-Bane wasn't up, right. But like, that was with the E still active. Point being, right, when I don't use my burst at the end, I still get the same amount of hits, I still get the same amount of charge attacks, and even normal attacks, infused with Pyro and with the buff active. But if I add the burst at the end, I just get an additional burst out of it. Now, in some teams, it's gonna be hard to vape that burst at the end, right? When you're using with Tangling, for example, in like Funerational. Sometimes it can be hard to vape the burst, but in a lot of the teams, it's actually pretty easy to vape the burst at the end. And when you vape it, that's a significant amount of damage you're adding to your rotation. Artifact set overview. Thoughts on 2-piece? Does Hu Tao have a definitive best in slot? Is it true that 4-piece Shimenawas is her best in slot? How good is 4-piece Gilded on her compared to other options? Yeah, let's start with an answer for the first question, which is thoughts on 2-piece sets. And my thoughts on 2-piece sets should be pretty evident if you look at my Hu Tao. 2-piece sets aren't going to be better at a baseline than a 4-piece set, but if your artifacts are better, then it might turn out to be overall stronger. Like in my case, no artifacts available for this slot. No artifacts available for this slot. I don't have Shimenawas. And while I do have Crimson Witch, right, I have this, I have 2 flowers, and hell, I even have a Pyro Goblet and a really good hat. The problem is, the Pyro Goblet only has like 3.5 useful stats, and I don't have an HP or an EM sense. This is my only sense. What that means is I have to use this. But I have significantly better off-piece Pyro Goblets, which means that if I go 2-piece with Wanderers, in my case, I can use this sense, that's quite good. This Feather, that's better than my other one. And and this goblet that's also a lot better than the Pyro, than the Crimson Witch one I have. And so because I gained so many stats from doing this, in my case, this is better. Hu Tao is not a unit that is particularly reliant on 4-piece set bonus. Like, the difference between a 4-piece set bonus Hu Tao and a non-4-piece set bonus Hu Tao is not actually that big compared to a unit like Raiden, right, where the difference is going to be pretty large. But it is still there, so if you are going to main Hu Tao, or at least play her a lot, there's definitely an argument to be made to farm a bunch for her. Does Hu Tao have a definitive best in slot? No. There are two sets that are generally her best sets, and those two sets are Crimson Witch and Shimenawa's. The thing is, they're good at different things. Shimenawa's will get your charge attacks to do more damage, whereas Crimson Witch will get your burst to do more damage, and will get you to be able to burst more often. When it comes to speedruns, people much prefer Shimenawa's for like chambers where Hu Tao is like the carry, because you'll get your energy back by the end of your burst, and you're not going to do a second rotation. So the energy requirements don't actually f you over too much. When it comes to speedruns where like she's just going to be there to one-shot a wave with her burst, and then you like with Ayaka or something, sometimes people end up preferring Crimson Witch instead, so that you can start with your burst. All in all, because Shimenawa's takes away some of your options, and because it's not actually significantly better when you look at like rotational damage, then I don't recommend Shimenawa's over Crimson Witch, unless you just already have a good Shimenawa's set, which a lot of people do because Emblem is a domain that people have been farming for a pretty long time. But generally, personally, I would recommend Crimson Witch over Shimenawa's, but there are definitely situations where Shimenawa's is better, and it's very possible that for your account, Shimenawa's is better. And finally, how good is 4-piece Gilded on her compared to her other options? It's kind of just like a worse version of Crimson Witch, but if you're going to be farming Gilded a lot, it can still work, especially if you don't play her in like double Pyro, because you get only like the EM bonuses. And when you're getting 230 EM from it, it's like actually pretty good. It's not quite as good generally as Crimson Witch and stuff like in Shimenawa's, but it is not far behind. It's not like one of the quote-unquote issues is that you do need to trigger a reaction, which means that like your first hit won't get the buff, but it's not that much because you start with a normal attack usually. Yeah, anyways, all of this to say, Gilded is fine, and if you are farming Gilded and Deepwood for your Dendro teams, you can also just use a Gilded set on Hu Tao. It's not bad. It's just, if you're going to be farming specifically for Hu Tao, that's not the domain to go for. EM or HP Sens? Generally EM. In my case, I use an HP Sense because I'm using Dragon's Bane and I have Elegy. The way that EM works is EM is better than HP at a baseline. It just is, and by law. But EM has actual true diminishing returns, which means the more EM you have, the least valuable EM is, or additional EM is. And it's not just percentage diminishing returns, it's also like flat diminishing returns. Like, it can fall off hard. Generally, if you're under 200 EM, you could probably use more EM. But obviously, if you have Elegy or other forms of EM buffs, like C2 Kazuha or something, then that can obviously mean that like you don't really want an EM Sens, right? At around 200 EM, with HP Sens, if you swapped to an EM Sens, it would be similar output. Which means that like at 400-ish EM on EM Sens, or like 200-ish EM on HP Sens, it's like somewhat similar. If you're not using Dragon's Bane, it's probably worth for you going EM Sens. That does also apply to Homa, by the way. Homa gives you more attack based on your HP. Obviously, it favors HP Sens more, right? No, it actually doesn't, because while yes, you get more attack based on your HP, you're also getting more attack from the fact that you already have HP before your EM Sens. You're gaining more attack, but you also have more attack, which means that the percentage increase from that more attack is actually about the same as if you didn't have Homa. Right, so basically just, even on Homa, it's the same idea. Generally, EM Sens are better. Unless you have a lot of EM, either through external buffs like Elegy, or through like a ton of EM artifacts. Okay, EM substats. Yeah, use the optimizer if you want a specific answer for your artifacts. Weapon overview. How do her weapon options stack up to each other in general? Is Lithic a good option now with double Hydro? And how is Scarlet Sands on her? For 5-star weapons, you kind of got like 3 choices. Jadewing Spear, Homa, Scarlet Sands. Homa's her best weapon. Scarlet Sands is pretty good. Jadewing Spear is meh. For 4-star weapons, you got Deathmatch, Dragon's Bane, White Tassel, I guess. And potentially Lithic, I guess. Lithic can actually be pretty decent if it's like high refine. Because, for example, you can play Funerational, which is Hu Tao, Sangling, Xingqiu, Yelan. You can play just double Hydro with Zhongli. The same thing, but with Zhongli instead of Sangling. And both of those are 4 Leah characters, which means that Lithic actually gets max value. So if it's high refine, like if it's R5, that's 28% crit rate from the passive, which is almost as much as what Deathmatch gives you, on top of also giving you 44 plus 27.6 attack, which makes it a pretty good option. But it's just realistically the only situation in which you have Lithic Spear is because you have Homa and you pull on the Homa banner and it had Lithic. Like, you don't have high refined Lithic if you're not wishing on weapon banners all the time. And at low refine, it's not that good because look about how the passive refines, and like, you don't care that much about the subs. Like, it's good, but it's not that great about the substat, and the attack percent isn't that great either. But you look at how it refines, and it refines affect the crit rate that you gain more than the attack. And it's like, oh, okay, so at high refine you gain a lot more crit rate than at low refine. I mean, hey, if you don't have Dragon's Bane, it's good. Like, use that, sure. But yeah, generally it's gonna be something between Dragon's Bane, Deathmatch, and I guess White Tassel. Jadewing Spear can be better than like a low refine Dragon's Bane. Generally worse than a high refine Dragon's Bane. Blacklift is kind of bait. If you have like 3 stacks, it's fine, but without a lot of stacks, it's kind of just like not really better than your other options. All right, Missive Wind Spear is a thing now. I forgot about that one. You gain attack and EM. Woo! It's generally going to be her free-to-play option if you got it. It's better than White Tassel, from what I understand. It's okay. But yeah, in general, you have like Homa, Scarlet Sands, and then a block with the rest. And that block with the rest has Deathmatch, has Dragon's Bane, has Lithic. But if you have high refined Lithic in a 4-Leah team, it goes similar to Scarlet Sands. C1 or Homa. Homa is transferable to other characters. C1 is arguably better for her. I would probably go for C1 over Homa, but at the end of the day, it's like, what do you care about more? Considering that they are around the same DPS increase, would you rather have easier to play, or weapon can be put on other people when you don't play your Hu Tao? Yeah, especially because in the upcoming banner, you have Xingqiu on Hu Tao's banner. If you don't have C6 Xingqiu, I think that's even more of an argument in favor of C1, because it means that you might get a few Xingqius along the way. Team overview, what are her general best vape archetype variations, and which one is her most free-to-play friendly? Okay, you can play her in what's probably like the most popular one, which is like double Hydro with Zhongli, but that's not necessarily all that free-to-play friendly because it requires 2 specific 5-stars. That being said, double Hydro is not only good with Zhongli, it's also good with other things, and actually it's generally better with other things when it comes to output. It just means that your shield won't be there. Personally, I'd much rather play, if I'm not against like enemies that can be knocked back, I'd much rather play Fischl over Zhongli, and you could also play Xiangling over Zhongli if you have double Hydro. You can play Toma, but I think with double Hydro it's like, and technically you can play a Dendro unit, but like I said earlier, I don't like that at all. Another option here is you can just go for an animal unit just for the grouping, basically, and for the increased damage on Xingqiu and Yelan. And technically, there is a rotation that lets you get a Pyro Swirl on, like, your second rotation, but it's not gonna happen, basically. If you don't have Yelan, then that means you can put a second Pyro unit in, and an animal unit, which means that you can very easily get a Pyro Swirl, right? So this is generally what people call VV Vape, because you get VV, and it's a vape team. And if you do this, your Pyro unit can be Bennett, can be Xiangling, but generally you wouldn't use her burst. Can be Yanfei, can be Xinyan, can be Amber, can be Toma, can be Cleep, perhaps, maybe even Diluc, who knows? Knock yourself out, have fun. You gotta use any Pyro units. Generally, I would recommend, if your Bennett is available, I would recommend him, because you won't die. Otherwise, something like Amber, maybe if you have Elegy. Otherwise, if you have C4 Yanfei, you can use Yanfei, right? Get that shield, otherwise maybe Toma, someone like that. This is not the only thing that you can do if you don't have Yolanda. You can also just go for like whatever. Go for double Geo. You can go for Zhongli Fischl. You can go for Cryo unit. You can even go for 2 Cryo units. This is generally something that I would not use against bosses because bosses can't be frozen, and because they don't get frozen, they don't get the frozen aura, which means that your Cryo can prevent you from vaping, and it can just remove your aura, and then you just apply Pyro and it won't react. Against non-bosses though, the frozen aura behaves like a Cryo aura, which means you can use it to melt instead of vaping. You can actually use an off-field Ayato, like Fav Ayato, just for his burst. It's a little bit of normal attack damage. You can use Kogumi, I guess, but meh, like Mona. But generally, these are kind of a little bit more cope, and I would try to stick to Double Geo, or Zhongli Fischl, or Fischl Sucrose, Fischl Kazuha, Fischl Beto can work as well. You can use Layla as well, which I don't have, so I didn't like think of her immediately. I don't like it too much if you don't have C1 Hu Tao, because you can't really dash cancel, and if you can't dash cancel, then you're gonna, well, you can't really dash, and if you can't really dash, then your shield's gonna break, and if your shield breaks, Lila sucks, because she doesn't generate energy. and she can't get her burst back. So yeah, at that point, I'd rather use Iona. You have a lot of flexibility when it comes to like the teams that aren't like the optimal ones, and even then, like they're still good teams. Double Hydro versus VV Vape, and has double Geo and VV Vape fallen off after double Hydro's debut. The main upside to VV Vape is that a larger portion of your damage is coming from Hu Tao herself. That means that a larger portion of your damage gets multiplied when you go for her weapon or for her C1. Which means that if you're gonna be a Hu Tao main, VV Vape will generally be where she performs at ceiling. Yeah, you also get a grouper because it's an animal unit, right? So you're generally running a grouper, which helps with AoE situations. However, the double Hydro is a little bit more brain dead. It performs better at like lower investment levels. All in all, I'd say that they both have their place. But yeah, double Geo definitely has fallen off. I mean, double Geo was never that great, but now it's definitely just like a lesser version of double Hydro most of the time. Can you demonstrate the various VV Vape double swirl setups? No. I have a video on my channel that demonstrates them already. I'm not doing this shit again. I'm too tired, bro. I've been at this for 3 hours, okay? There are so many questions in this, man. Should have put that earlier. We can probably leave a link or leave like, I know there's like this weird thing where, right, like here, you can put like an eye thing. We can probably put a link to that over there. You can click on it if you want to see the rotations for some of the VV Vape double swirl setups. And lastly, can you do some of her voice lines in both English and Japanese? Dude, I'm actually really tired, so I don't know if I'll be able to.
Crossover! Ha! Time to go! Cheer! Pyre, pants on fire! Silly chub, Billy chub, silly, hilly chub. Woo! Yahoo! Itarashai! San! Yahoo! Sayonara! Hop! Ryoge no cha! Da cho cho bing yao, chu chu chow. San cho cho chai yao, si chu chu ow. Hirucharu no Nissan ga byoki ni natta. Hirucharu no Nissan ga kanbyou shite.